project manager with the DEQ. I will pass it on to Air Quality Administrator Ali Mirzakalili for opening remarks in a minute. But first, some ground rules. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted to the DEQ website. To help this be a good experience, everyone has been muted. Please stay muted. That will allow us to hear the main presenter. Please submit your questions via the chat box. Eric Steele, DEQ Diesel Coordinator, and I will be managing the chat box, and we'll either answer your questions or bring them to presenters' attention at the end of the presentation. The presentation is posted to the DEQ website. The link is on the screen. Please email any additional questions to the address on the screen. For media inquiries only, please contact Susan Mills. Susan's email is on the screen as well. With this, I am happy to introduce the DEQ Air Quality Division Administrator, Ali Mirzakalili.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Svetlana. Again, my name is Ali Mirzakalili, and I'm the Air Quality Division Administrator with DEQ. On behalf of the department, I would like to welcome everyone who is joining us today for this special event. We are excited to have you here to learn more about non-road diesel emissions in Oregon. And I'm just going to stop and do a sound check. Svetlana, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
I can hear you.
I want to set the stage by providing some background. I'm going to be brief so we can jump right into the presentation. So as many of you know, there has been widespread recognition for many years now that diesel exhaust is harmful to public health and contributes to climate change. This exhaust contains a variety of harmful pollutants like nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, formaldehyde, and ultrafine particles. Exposure to pollutants contained in diesel exhaust has been linked to a variety of cardiovascular, pulmonary, and neurologic diseases. In this context, the Environmental Quality Commission, DEQ, adopted a health-based clean air goal for ambient benchmark concentration for diesel particulates as far back as 2006. In April of 2012, the Portland Air Toxic Solutions, or PATS, Committee recognized the potential negative impact of emissions originating from non-road diesel construction equipment. When they released their final report, it included a recommendation to better define the quantity, age, activity levels, and location of use for this equipment across the Portland metro area. That was the focus of that study. In June of 2012, concern about diesel exhaust grew when an International Agency for Research on Cancer reclassified its designation of diesel exhaust from probably carcinogenic to definitely carcinogenic. The latest available national emission inventory, which is 2014 right now, data indicates that in Oregon, approximately 45% of mobile source diesel particulate comes from non-road heavy-duty diesel equipment. Since this category is not well characterized when compared with the on-road fleet, the importance of learning more about this significant source of emissions cannot be overstated. The Oregon legislature has been studying diesel engine emissions and engaging in policy conversations related to diesel engine emissions for over a decade now. In 2017, the legislature appropriated $500,000 in the end of session bill to fund a statewide and comprehensive non-road diesel emissions inventory. A budget note accompanying the appropriation directed DEQ to contract with a third party to conduct a study and to engage with stakeholders along the way. DEQ has done that, and we are here today to report on this effort on this webinar. As of today, Oregon is among a select few states that have undertaken statewide non-road diesel emission inventory. And after watching our staff go through the challenging project, I have a better insight into why. I'm sure it was no easy feat to attempt to count and characterize this highly variable and specialized equipment. For that reason, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to ERG for the comprehensive study and that they have conducted over the last 19 months, and for the work that they have produced. And I'm just going to turn it back to Svetlana to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Welcome to those who may just have joined us. Before I introduce Rick, I would just like to give a quick reminder that the webinar will be recorded, and we may be reaching the capacity on this webinar. If we do, the webinar will be posted to DEQ's website. The presentation slides also have been posted to the DEQ website. You see the link on the screen. The questions, please submit your questions by chat box. Eric Seeley and I will be answering, or will bring them to presenters' attention at the very end of the presentation. For the past year and a half, we at DEQ had the pleasure of working with Rick Baker of the Eastern Research Group. For the past 25 years, Rick has served as a project manager and or a technical lead for over a dozen studies, just like this one, characterizing non-road equipment emissions. We've enjoyed working with Rick here at DEQ, and it is my pleasure to introduce him. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen so Rick can share his.
Okay. Thank you, Svetlana. Okay. And there we go. Thank you. And let me return that. I've had a really enjoyable and at times arduous, but definitely enjoyable interaction with DEQ over the last 18 months. And it's my pleasure to present the results of the study. I'm Rick Baker with Eastern Research Group, and we're going to spend the next half hour or so going over the results of the non-road diesel engine inventory study that we conducted for DEQ. Get that off my screen. There we go. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'll introduce the project team. I'll review the scope of work and talk briefly about how we collected the necessary data for the study. I'll give a quick review of how we estimated the emissions associated with the non-road equipment. I will select key findings to highlight. We will talk about how we validated the accuracy of the results, and then we have a brief section on conclusions and recommendations. So Eastern Research Group was the lead contractor. We have extensive experience, as Svetlana noted, in performing non-road equipment emissions inventories around the country. We have a specific, detailed experience working on construction and agricultural profiles. We also contracted with a good company who is located in Eugene, and we're leveraging off of their familiarity with a state and local agency fleet operations. So they were the lead for the public fleet survey component of the study. We also contracted with Oakleaf Environmental, and they are located in Michigan, but we brought them on board to be the sector lead for the logging survey, given their extensive experience developing the national logging inventory for Canada. And they also provided extensive technical support for validation of the study findings. So, scope of the project. As many of you know, this was authorized, the funding for the study was authorized by House Bill 5006 back in 2017, and we commenced in September of 2018, and we are just wrapping up this month. The study was designed to estimate non-road diesel equipment emissions for Oregon. And specifically, we wanted to replace the current information that is used in EPA's MOVES non-road model with Oregon-specific information. Now, EPA's MOVES non-road model estimates emissions for non-road equipment at the national, state, and county level for different calendar years. And up to this point, it has been relied upon by Oregon DEQ to produce the state's estimates. The key inputs for the model include the number of pieces of equipment by equipment type, the horsepower of the equipment, activity in hours per year, and the engine age distribution, which determine what emission standards are being met for different components of the fleet. So this effort is intended to improve the accuracy of the MOVE's default estimates using bottom-up Oregon-specific activity estimates. The results of the analysis can provide updates for emissions reporting requirements for the state, as well as air quality modeling efforts, and it can provide the basis for future year emissions estimates as well. Another thing that the data can be used for is to characterize equipment owners and operators to help identify potential targets for grant and subsidy programs, such as retrofit, repower, and replacement. The study covered all diesel and non-road equipment greater than 25 horsepower operating in Oregon during the 2017 calendar year. Now this covers about 65 pieces of equipment, so it's a very broad range of things. Everything from tractors, backhoes, and portable generators are examples. It does exclude locomotives, commercial marine vessels, and aircraft. The emissions inventories for those sources are characterized independently by EPA and DEQ. Now, so what we're doing, we're characterizing activity in order to estimate different emissions or criteria pollutants such as particulate matter, or diesel particulate matter in this case, greenhouse gases, and toxics emissions. We said our base year is the 2017 calendar year. The resolution is at the county level, the spatial resolution, and the temporal resolution, we estimate both annual emissions and emissions for a typical summer weekday. Okay. So we had a three-pronged approach tailored to the different operator and industry categories in order to collect the required information for the study. Now, the first approach targeted public fleets and surveyed them for their equipment use information. Now, multiple approaches were needed because the equipment category list is so broad, as is the list of industries involved. So first thing we did is we kind of isolated these public fleets for a specific analysis and data collection approach. Now, these included fleets owned by municipalities, counties, airports and ports, the special districts across Oregon, other government agencies. We had a survey for schools and universities, as well as permitted facilities like municipal solid waste and material recovery sites. Now, what these have in common, they're all known locations. There's often captive fleets at a specific place, so they're easy to identify and relatively easy to contact the equipment managers. So our goal here was to attempt a full census of the equipment, not just to sample from it, but to try and get a complete listing of all the equipment. Now, that wasn't possible for everything, but we did get a large fraction of this fleet characterized. The second approach, random sample surveys for other sectors, such as the agricultural sector, logging, and surface mining. Also included in there was a more targeted survey for crane operators and rigging companies. Now, what this group has in common, there are numerous operators. It's not like the handful of airports in the state where we can go and contact everybody. There's too many to contact all of them, and it's also difficult to generalize their equipment use. Now, so when we went out and requested the information, we had a strong emphasis on maintaining data confidentiality because now we're getting into the private sector, into private fleet operators rather than public fleet management systems. Now, as part of this effort, trade association support was critical to encouraging participation and ensuring the validity of the results for each category. So survey details. What did we collect for, and this is true for both the first and second approaches. We requested information on equipment type, on the engine horsepower, the model year of the engine, the activity level in terms of hours per year, and also how was that activity spread across time for the summer months, for weekdays versus weekends. We requested information on location of operation, although that is challenging for certain types of equipment, such as logging and cranes or portable rock crushers used in surface mining that just get moved around regularly during the course of a year. But we made our best effort to identify the primary counties of operation. And we also requested information on fuel consumption, which was generally obtained at the fleet level rather than at the equipment specific level. This was important information for validation purposes, as I'll show later. The third approach that we used. Here we characterized equipment activity for specific industry sectors and tasks. It was primarily used for the construction sectors, for example, for highway and road construction, commercial and institutional buildings, single-family home development, and utility work. We also used this approach to develop profiles for well drilling and for agricultural support services. Now, the thing that this group has in common is that they all have pretty much detailed project information is available on them. For example, for single-family housing, we have the number of permits issued at the county level in 2017 from the U.S. Census Bureau. And we have similar levels of granular, detailed information available for these other sectors as well, for the most part. Now, how we began this process is we would develop a standardized project task list and equipment productivity profiles for those separate tasks. So a typical task might include something like land clearing or utility line installation or paving. And then we would take that and combine that with the available project quantity information to estimate total activity. So how did we develop these standardized task and task lists and productivity estimates? Well, we had extensive consultation with industry subject matter experts that we were able to link up with through different trade associations such as the Associated General Contractors. And these subject matter experts provided input to account for organ-specific practices and task frequencies, what types of equipment were preferred for certain tasks, and what kind of regional variations there might be across the state that we needed to account for. And just a quick example there, in some of the central Oregon counties, the geology is vastly different than in other areas. So blasting and crushing is required for site preparation there. And so we would take that into account. And we would combine that with other information that we had from previous studies or industry guidebooks, other supplementary information in order to complete these task and equipment productivity profiles. So for each one of those, we would have an estimate, say, of an excavator would be able to install so many linear feet of a utility line per hour. And we would combine that with the actual physical quantity information, such as, well, we would know from a particular data source that there were 10,000 linear feet of a utility line installation in a certain area. And so that's how we could estimate the total amount of activity. Now, this quantity information came from various sources. One source that provided particularly detailed information was the Oregon Department of Transportation's bid item records. When they send out a request for bid, they will be very precise and detailed in exactly what their contractor is expected to provide. So a typical bid item might specify the square yards of asphalt paving required for a given project. Other quantity information, I already mentioned the Census Bureau records for housing permits. Square feet of building installation was obtained from a data vendor called Dodge Analytics. Welling drill depths were available from the Oregon Water Resources Department. So there were a slate of different data sources that we pulled upon to get this sort of project-specific quantity information from. And so once we compiled all that and combined it with the equipment productivity profiles, we got the estimated hours of use by equipment type and horsepower for each project. And once we had that, we were able to combine that with engine age distribution information, which is obtained from a separate industry survey, to estimate emissions. And that's our end goal. So how did we estimate emissions? Well, first of all, we processed all the survey and industry profile data, and went through extensive quality assurance. We gap filled any missing data fields. Then we would apply scaling factors and to extrapolate the activity estimates from the project and surveys that we had up to the state level. Then we had this sort of statewide profile of activity for these different survey and industry sectors. And we allocated that back down to the county level. Now, where possible, we also adjusted the estimates of engine load factors. And so here I'm just referring to the output for a particular engine. So at idle, the load is effectively 0, and at full power, it's 100%. Then, once we had all that, we ran EPA's MOVE's Nonroad model, applying updated hours of use, horsepower, and model year distributions, which allowed us to generate the Oregon-specific emissions estimates for all these equipment types. We compiled everything and then compared those results from the current study with the EPA MOVE's model defaults. Okay, and now I'd like to share with you some of the key findings from the study. Now, the top chart here shows the statewide annual fuel consumption by industry and fleet sector. And this really tracks one-to-one with greenhouse gas emissions. So it's essentially the same distribution for those. And you'll see that agriculture, right here, has the highest fuel consumption at the state level, followed by logging down here, and then by construction, with the other sectors listed, all being at 10% or less than 10% each. Now, down here, I have a corresponding chart showing PM 2.5 emissions, or as I mentioned, effectively diesel particulate matter emissions by sector. And it looks similar, but there are some notable differences. First, you'll see that agriculture has actually a larger percentage contribution for particulates than it did for fuel consumption. And that's mostly due to the fact that the equipment fleet, mostly agricultural tractors actually, are just much older than a lot of equipment that are out there, with an average age of 22 years. That effectively means half the tractor fleet is uncontrolled. They don't have any emissions control. We refer to them as Tier 0 engines. And because of that, you get a disproportionate rise in the amount of total particulate at the state level relative to fuel consumption. You'll still see the ranking is pretty much retained, though, where we have logging coming in second, and then construction followed by the other ones. Now, we can also break this information out geographically. And here, once again, we've got PM 2.5 emissions by region. We We do have this information at the county level, but it's just too hard to present on the slide that way. So we group these into regions. And not unexpectedly, the Portland Metro and Willamette Valley regions have the highest contributions to PM 2.5 emissions, followed by what we're referring to as the Southeast, South Central, and Northeast regions. And we can provide, exactly what these county level breakouts are upon request, and it's in the report as well. So let's actually take a quick look at the county level information. So once again, PM 2.5 we're looking at here, and we're looking at how the industry contributions vary by county. And there can be substantial variations, as you would expect. We have examples here to demonstrate the prevalence of different industry impacts. So for Multnomah, the predominant source of PM emissions is construction equipment. For Lane County, it's logging. And for Klamath County, it's agriculture. And this information is available for DEQ and everyone to drill down into through the report. Okay. Now, this is another, I want to look at the data in a different way. Previously, we've been looking at how equipment use and emissions are distributed across end users, across different industries and fleets. Here we're going to be looking at how fuel consumption and emissions are distributed across equipment types. And it can be a little confusing because we have a construction, on the previous page, we have a construction industry sector, and here we have a construction and mining equipment type. And there are some commonalities here, but they're not one and the same. Just as an example, these equipment types are defined by EPA's MOVES modeling conventions, and construction equipment includes, as an example, backhoes. Backhoes are definitely used in the construction industry. However, they are very prevalent elsewhere, including agriculture and other industrial applications and public fleets. So there isn't a precise one-to-one correspondence between these equipment type categories and the industry profiles that we were using before. However, we do need to present the information at this equipment type level so that we can have a direct comparison with the MOVES model outputs. MOVES does not provide outputs for the agricultural industry per se, but it does provide outputs for agricultural equipment, such as tractors, irrigation sets, that sort of thing. Okay, so given that long-winded caveat, here are the results for comparing both fuel consumption and PM 2.5 emissions between the study and what the MOVES default model outputs. So we actually see that the statewide fuel consumption estimates for the MOVES model here on the left are substantially higher than what we found in the study. However, the total criteria pollutant emissions are closer. They're more similar. That said, you do see notable differences in patterns across different equipment categories. The construction and mining, both equipment and emissions, we have the study showing a significant decrease in both activity and emissions relative to MOVES. On the other hand, logging, we see the reverse pattern. We see higher activities as measured by fuel consumption and higher emissions for logging activity compared to what MOVES estimated. As a third example, agriculture is actually fairly similar. And it all depends on a number of factors, the engine age distribution of the equipment and the hours per year being most important. I'll talk about that a little bit more here, right here actually. So, one of the key determinants in determining what your total emissions are is what is your engine age distribution, or more specifically, what is the distribution of the engine standards that are being met across the fleet, where there are actually 5 different groupings of engine emission standards specified by EPA, starting with Tier 0 and going up through Tier 4, and each becoming successively more stringent, meaning that a Tier 0, or basically uncontrolled piece of equipment, is going to emit much higher or has much higher emission rates than a Tier 4 piece of equipment, which is fully equipped with advanced control technologies. Now, I'm showing a selection of the top 3 categories here, where we have agricultural, logging, and construction and mining. That's responsible for over 3/4 of all fuel consumption. Now, there are other tier level breakouts that are available in the report and model year distributions that can be viewed, but these are really responsible for the lion's share of activity and emissions. So we do notice some trends here. Moves tends to overestimate the fraction of Tier 4 units and underestimate the fraction of Tier 0s. And that's very clear in actually all 3 of these histograms. However, there are interesting differences by sector. For example, we see real extreme variations in, especially down here in the tails, in the Tier 0 and Tier 4 distributions, comparing moves and the study results in the construction and mining equipment sector, and also in agricultural. There's a little closer correspondence maybe in the Tier 2 category right there in the middle. Logging is particularly interesting and illustrative, where the moves model, you can't really even see it, but there is some very small amounts of like Tier 2 equipment assumed for moves. But moves is assuming a very high activity rate, or it's about 1,300 hours per year assumed for logging equipment. And what the moves model does is it assumes that if a piece of equipment is being operated that much, it's going to be scrapped and replaced relatively quickly compared to other types of equipment. And so it doesn't take into account sort of the tail end distribution that's still hanging on there past what moves assumes is the equipment's expected useful life. Now, all that said, there is a notable fraction of Tier 4 equipment for all of these sectors. It's either first or second most common of all the tier levels. So there's obviously been significant movement across industries here to purchase new equipment and to retire older units, where it's most evident in, excuse me, down here. So let me move on to one other way that we can look at the data, which is how is the activity distributed across time. And I have here an example for the summer season fractions estimated by the different industry sectors. Most of the sectors have 1/3 or more of their activity occurring during the summer. It's generally expected. The strongest summer peaks are seen for agriculture, logging, boating, and lawn and garden equipment. Once again, that's to be expected. Let me talk for a little bit about how we validated the survey results. Now, the purpose of a validation exercise is to ensure that the results are consistent and reasonable. And we have 2 types of validation that we're going to look at. First is internal consistency checks that we conducted using data that was actually reported, and we're comparing different data parameters to one another. For example, I've got a chart here from the agricultural surveys comparing the reported fuel consumption for all the equipment that each respondent had to the fuel consumption that we estimate using their reported hours per year and horsepower values that they report. And what you want to see is a nice straight line, which we do. We do have some unit transformations here along the side to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. But generally, this sort of distribution where it's falling along a line fairly regularly is demonstrating that we have internal consistency in the data that's being reported on activity from the agriculture sector. And we had similar analyses done for logging and other sectors. We also spent spent a fair amount of effort regarding external consistency checks. Now here we compare the study's fuel consumption and activity estimates at the sector level and at the total level with independent data sources. So the first of these was the Energy Information Administration's Fuel Oil and Kerosene Sales Survey, known as FOAKS. We also have the Agricultural Census, which is completed every 5 years, and fortunately for us, the latest one was completed in 2017, so it allowed a direct comparison for that sector. We also had access to historical data from the Economic Census for Construction, which was important for validating activity for the construction sector. There were other sources that we used, such as FAA data for airport activity and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers data for marine ports. That information wasn't used to validate total fuel consumption, but rather how was fuel consumption and activity distributed spatially over the counties. So there was a slightly different validation that was going on in parallel with the total fuel consumption check. Now, here is a comparison with the FOAKS non-road diesel fuel sales estimates. Now, FOAKS is our primary point of reference here, given the breadth of the sectors surveyed in that effort. Other data sources are considered in detail in the report, though. But this is a convenient way to summarize some of the findings. First of all, the study estimates a somewhat higher fuel consumption than FOAKS does. So FOAKS is here on the left, the study's on the right. As a matter of fact, it's a 39% increase above the FOAKS level is what we estimate. And I do want to put that estimate into a little bit broader context. Some folks on the line may remember that around 10 or 15 years ago, there was a similar fuel validation that was performed for the California's non-road fleet that found a 300% difference between independent data sources and what had been developed, and that served as the basis for making some significant updates to California's inventory. So, we have applied some of those same procedures here in validating this study, and so we're at a much more consistent level. Of course, there are uncertainties associated with both the survey results and the FOAKS survey. So keeping that in mind, we believe that this difference is reasonably consistent with what we would expect. One other thing to note is that one of the primary sources of difference here is really coming from logging. And we have reason to believe that the FOAKS data may be particularly uncertain for this sector. And because of that, we performed really extensive additional validation of the logging sector results to be confident of the findings, and those are all presented in detail in the report if you're interested. Main conclusions. First of all, the study provides a comprehensive assessment of non-road diesel equipment activity and emissions for Oregon. As was mentioned earlier, Oregon is just the third state to develop a bottom-up statewide profile for these equipment. And the findings represent a substantial improvement to the activity and emissions estimates used by the state compared with EPA's MOVE's non-road model defaults. Summarize some of the key findings. The study concludes that MOVE's generally overestimates equipment activity and correspondingly greenhouse gas emissions. Several criteria air pollutant emission estimates are generally consistent with MOVE at the state level, but the findings shed light on county and regional level differences in the district. The agriculture sector has the highest level of activity and emissions at the state level, followed by logging and construction. MOVE substantially underestimates logging activity and emissions, we concluded. On the flip side, MOVE substantially overestimates construction activity and emissions, but even though that sector is still notable in certain counties. Just to wrap, we want to acknowledge that there are some remaining uncertainties associated with the study, including we did get a lower than hoped for response from like large landfills in the permitted facilities category. So it might be worth revisiting that and surveying a few more to improve that profile. There was also one particular element in the surface mining sector survey where we relied on a fuel efficiency factor, which is expressed in terms of tons of product produced per gallon, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty associated with that factor, which would influence the results for that sector as well. One thing I did not mention before, but for transportation refrigeration units, they're also known as TRUs, and these are basically, they're used to control cargo temperature in freight trucks across the state, and they're really pervasive. They're, if you look on the highway, we'll see these attached to trailers pretty frequently. And we weren't able to obtain, organ-specific operation information for the TRUs. And so we relied fairly extensively on MOVE's defaults for this category, and we have a total of 6% total fuel consumption attributable to these units. That's worth a relook down the road. Alternative sources of information become available. There was also some significant uncertainty for railway maintenance equipment and activity and emissions. However, we estimate that the fuel consumption level there is pretty low, maybe 0.5%, so this may not be a real significant source of uncertainty in the big picture. Finally, one thing to keep in mind is that the study was for the 2017 year, so it's just a snapshot of activity and emissions for that calendar year. And so there needs to be a way of projecting emissions forward in order to use it for air quality modeling and planning purposes, et cetera, going forward. And it would need to be consistent with the base case profiles that we developed and the way that we broke out activity. It would need to account for which industries and regions are expected to grow rapidly, which equipment are over the fastest, et cetera. And so that would be one of the next steps for DEQ to investigate going forward. And that is it. I can turn control back over to Svetlana, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can keep the slides up, I guess.
Thank you, Rick. We have been getting quite a few questions. So let's see. One of the questions, I think, in the order that we received was, did the study look at whether any of the T4 emission control devices were still intact and maintained, or whether the owners removed controls?
The study did not involve field audits of equipment. We did request information on if something had been retrofit or repowered. But as far as possible tampering, that is not something that was investigated by the study.
Okay. And another question was, does this take into account usage for hours per year? For example, if Tier 0 is owned but not used, was it still counted?
If a piece of equipment was not used in 2017, it was not included in the inventory. We only included pieces that were actively used.
Okay. Any other questions that Eric didn't answer?
Svetlana, this is Eric Feely. We've got a couple here. So maybe, Rick, you could talk a little bit about the EPA MOVES model. A question about whether EPA announced recently that the MOVES non-road model doesn't work, and how that was factored into the analysis that you performed.
The model does have some constraints associated with the very sort of granular equipment-specific emissions workup that we were doing. However, we made sure to, during our processing and post-processing, to address any of those issues. So everything that we have should be consistent with the way the model it works in the aggregate. At the high aggregation level, it's just fine. It's when you sort of break out the detailed emissions factors by engine tier level and technology type and try to apply them across model years, it becomes a little tricky. But we actually coordinated with EPA OTAC to develop a procedure to make sure that we captured everything as accurately as possible.
Thanks. Next question. Does the study take into account usage of equipment? So like hours per year. If there's a Tier 0 that is owned but almost never used, how would that be counted and accounted for in the study?
Well, actually, that sounds fairly similar to the prior question. If something wasn't used at all, it was not included. If it just had a low level of usage, it was included. And we were, especially with the surveys, the survey information where we had information on specific pieces of equipment, we would go and use the appropriate emission factor, which would be expressed in horsepower hour per year. And apply that for that piece of equipment, even if it was a very low usage piece. And that would also take into account low deterioration rates, assuming that it was consistently used at a low usage level.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I hadn't realized we were going to be studying fuel use. What exactly is the value of that? The purpose of the study was to focus on the impact on air quality of equipment types, age, and emission types.
Right. So fuel use is relevant most importantly for a validation perspective, because fuel use and activity are tightly linked. And if we get our estimates of activity correct, our corresponding estimates of fuel use should be validated against independent data sources. So it's basically a way of tracking and validating activity, which of course has a direct impact on emissions as well.
Great. Let's see here. Just sorting through some of the questions. Cutting to the chase, what does this study tell us about what is needed to bring down the large amount of particulates that we saw in an urban environment like Multnomah County in terms of age of equipment, type of equipment, including large firms versus small firms, hours used in the airshed, et cetera? So does the study address those issues?
Well, it allows, we provided DEQ with, all the detailed results of the analysis. which is aggregated at the county level. The data is limited to a certain extent in that it's not a lot of it's not project specific, like surveys and that sort of thing. They were aggregated to protect client confidentiality. However, there is detailed information at the county level available regarding which sources of equipment are responsible for different proportions of emissions, and there's definitely information available on age distributions, which can be evaluated to help identify targets for control opportunities, for, like I said, grant programs, retrofits, that sort of thing. I think some of that question might be better answered by DEQ, though, regarding the intended use of the data.
Agreed, and we'll be looking at this report over the coming weeks and months. We have yet to receive the report, so we'll be receiving the final report by the end of the week. We just wanted to bring Rick in to showcase the sort of high-level results for everybody, in order to be as transparent as possible, so folks can see the data as quickly as possible. But we'll be looking through the report as we receive it by the end of the week. So thank you for that. Another question here: did you receive equal supporting information from the agriculture, logging, and construction segments?
Can you repeat that one more time, Eric?
It's a little bit vague, but essentially, in terms of information that you received from the different sectors, did you receive equal support from all of the different sectors, ag, logging, and construction?
We definitely received support from all sectors. We believe that we have a valid profile for each one of those sectors, for both equipment characteristics and use, simply because the results from the validation exercise were pretty consistent. So yes, we believe that we received adequate or more than adequate response from those sectors.
Great. So I'm just looking through. Svetlana, I'll turn it over to you. Are you seeing other questions that have not been addressed?
Let's see.
Hopefully we got to all of your questions in the chat box, but go ahead.
There is a question here. Does DEQ have an estimate of PM 2.5 contribution from road diesel emissions to compare to the non-road in Multnomah County area? And let's see. The answer, yes, I believe I do have that information, and NEI provides that information.
Yeah, Joe, if you want to just send an email to us at the link that Svetlana provided on slide 1, and she'll provide it here at the end, we'll get you that information.
There was another question if DEQ was going to share the data they obtained in this study, and yes, we will share everything aggregated at the county level. Okay, I think.
I'm seeing one more here, Svetlana. So I think it's a high-level question, Rick, and I know you answered it, but let's just drive the point home. So based on these data, can you tell us if exposure to DPM is higher, lower, or about what was expected in the state? And obviously, we're just talking about the non-road equipment here. So give us a high level.
Well, and on the right pie chart here. Okay, actually that's just percentages. I hesitate to say too much. At the state level, particulate matter was reason or relatively close to what MOVES was predicting in the aggregate anyway, even though it's distributed very differently than MOVES estimates. That said, I can't speak to exposure. Dispersion modeling, that's beyond the scope of this study. It's something that you can use the results of this study to help, refine those estimates, but that's not something that I can speak to.
Fair enough. Okay. Let's see. Would you expect that in the years ahead that the overall emissions and particulate will decrease as older units are retired?
Absolutely. And it will obviously, and I'm speaking a little bit outside my area of expertise, but this is obviously going to be impacted by economic factors. When there's slowdowns, and that's going to change the turnover rates as opposed to a boom cycle. But that said, inexorably, equipment is retired. Older equipment is retired and replaced by newer equipment. It's just a matter of the rate that happens. So every year, given especially the vast difference between a Tier 0 emission rate and a Tier 4 emission rate used at the same activity level, that there's incrementally, very significant reductions, at least on the equipment-specific level going forward in time.
Great. Another question here. Given the dramatically oversized proportional contribution of diesel particulate matter from construction activity in Multnomah County, would you recommend, this is obviously DEQ, would you recommend policy measures that target diesel particulate reduction from this sector in Oregon's largest urban areas? I won't put that on you, Rick. This is obviously more of a policy-related question. But Mark, thank you for that question. We'll be analyzing the report in the weeks and months ahead, and coming up with what we think are the best recommendations based on the analysis of the report. So we do appreciate that question, and we're also asking those same questions right now. And when we receive the complete report from ERG, we'll be looking into those questions.
There's one more question. Would you expect that in the years ahead that the overall emissions and particulates will decrease as older units are retired?
Yes, that sounds very similar to the other question. Yes,
yes.
We would expect those reductions.
Sorry, folks, we're having, we're doing the best we can here to field these things. Obviously, in this new world, each new software is a little bit different to work with. So thank you for your patience on that. But I'm not seeing any more questions. Svetlana, I think I do see a couple of people typing, so it's unclear whether we want to wait a minute or so to allow those folks to ask their questions. We do have until 11:30, but we want to give folks the opportunity here. So I do see a question from David Green. Will the data be used to update the PATS model of effects in the three-county region? We'll address that in our wrap-up comments, but thank you for that comment, David, or that question. Still got a couple of folks here typing.
While people are typing, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website within a few days. The presentation slides have already been posted to our website. Let's see. I see another question for you, Eric.
Question about how this work will show up in our Volkswagen rulemaking. Well, my understanding is the rulemaking is very much focused on how the grant program will operate. So I think that's unclear. I think certainly it would be worthwhile bringing it up, as you are, John, on the Rules Advisory Committee. I would definitely bring that to the attention of the committee. But at this point, we haven't walked through the relationship between the information that will be provided in this report by the end of the week and its relationship to the rulemaking. But I think those are some good questions to be asking for sure.
Also, please continue sending your questions to the email address that was provided at the beginning of the presentation. We want to hear all your questions and concerns, and we'll answer and post all questions and answers. The report will also be posted sometime next week. And if there aren't any more questions at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ali Mirzakhalili, the DEQ Air Quality Division Administrator, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for all your good questions. Thanks, Rick, for your presentation here. And I'm sorry we can't show it by applause, but I'm clapping for you. So thank you again. That was a really interesting presentation. It's clear that this was a very comprehensive analysis of a significant source of diesel emissions for us. Overall, I think what the presentation indicates that statewide numbers look similar to EPA. That was at least my takeaway. However, the study highlights the regional differences in Oregon. For example, logging emissions dominate in Lane County and construction in Multnomah County. We'll be looking over these results over the next weeks and months to see what else we can learn from the data. We also learned a lot about engine tier level distribution, and that's also will play a part in our thinking. We plan to use this information from the study to help us focus on the most polluting diesel equipment. In the coming months and years, we will be rolling out our VW grant program, and I think that question came up, to help clean up our older diesel vehicles and equipment. We will also be working to help support contractors seeking to comply with new clean contracting standards. So we will review the report fully and look at how to incorporate what we learned from this survey into our future mobile source emission inventory and air quality modeling efforts in order to better understand the air quality impact of non-road diesel engines used in Oregon and to develop the most effective strategies to mitigate their impact. So again, I think we have a bunch of process and follow-up to do here. I want to thank you. Thank you, Archie, for the presentation. Thank the legislature for their support and funding of the study, and thank everybody, the stakeholders who helped provided data to the study, and thank the staff for working with the ERG on this, and then their continued effort in analyzing the data that's come before us. So I'll stop there, turn it over back to you, to Svetlana, to wrap us up.
Svetlana, are you muted?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was trying to maintain the quality of sound. So
maybe, Svetlana, you can put up the slide that you had up at the beginning that has the contact information for folks to submit further questions.
Yes, Rick, you need to unshare your screen for that. Okay, can you see the slide? That slide. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to thank Rick and Ali, and most importantly, every one of you for being here with us. And we look forward to continue working with all of you. And I'd like to remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded and will be posted. The presentation, the link to the presentation is on the screen. All email questions, please send them to the email address on the screen right now. And for media inquiries only, please contact Susan Mills. Her email is on the screen as well. And thank you again for your interest and for being here. And I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you.